Chapter 1. The Beginning of the End. James awoke, eyes blurry, his head pounding from the previous night's Hennessy mixed with Percocets. The dingy apartment on Peachtree Street was bathed in an eerie, red-tinged light filtering through the grimy windows. Something felt off. Maybe it was the drugs, but he couldn't quite place it. As he threw the blankets off himself, he lay there for a minute thinking about the night before. Before getting out of bed and stumbling to his feet, a distant sound of screams pierced the air. This was no ordinary scream. This scream sounded like a pack of coyotes yipping. This sound jolted him fully awake. Rushing to the window, James's eyes widened in disbelief. The streets below were in chaos. People were running, their faces distorted in terror as they fled from something. He squinted, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. That's when he saw it. A man, his movements were choppy and unnatural, sinking his teeth into the neck of a woman who had fallen to the ground. James watched as he saw the man bite a chunk of flesh from the woman's neck, blood spraying and oozing from the open wound. "What the fuck?" James muttered, his mind racing to comprehend what he was witnessing. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, James's survival instincts kicked in. He'd been through hell before, and he wasn't about to let whatever this was take him down. Moving with purpose, he grabbed the duffel bag from under his bed, always packed and ready to go, a habit from his days running with the gangs and being a drug dealer. James caught his reflection in the cracked mirror as he dressed. The tattoos that covered his arms and chest were a roadmap of his past life, each one a reminder of the sins he'd committed and the price he'd paid. He pushed the memories aside, focusing on the task at hand. Strapping on his shoulder holster, James checked his Springfield XDM .45 caliber handgun. He always left it loaded in case shit hit the fan, either from his past or the government overstepping their power. The gun's weight was comforting, a reminder of the power he held in his hands. He grabbed extra ammunition, stuffing it into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. As he made his way down the creaking stairs of the apartment building, James could hear the chaos growing louder. The screams were more frequent now, punctuated by the occasional gunshot. He paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath before pushing open the door and stepping out into the madness. The scene that greeted him was like something out of a nightmare. Bodies littered the street, some still moving in grotesque, chaotic ways. People ran in all directions, their faces full of pure terror. In the distance, smoke rose from burning buildings, and the wail of sirens filled the air. James's eyes darted around, assessing the situation. His gaze landed on the Georgia State Capitol building, its gold dome now a stark contrast to the horror unfolding beneath it. He watched in disbelief as a group of what he could only describe as zombies swarmed a police officer, tearing into him with inhuman ferocity. The zombies ripped apart the officer, tearing his limbs off and clawing at his groin. Since the officer was wearing his bulletproof vest, the only thing the zombies could dig their fingers into was his groin, where one zombie bit off his cock. "This can't be real," James muttered, but the rational part of his brain knew that denial wouldn't keep him alive. As he made his way down Peachtree Street, James's mind raced with questions. How had this happened? Was it some kind of virus? A government experiment gone wrong? A space virus, genetically grown chicken? He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on staying alive and figuring out his next move. The streets were a gauntlet of danger. James moved swiftly, using the skills he'd honed during his years as a gangster to avoid detection. He ducked behind abandoned cars and slipped through alleyways, always keeping one eye on his surroundings and one hand on his weapon. As he approached Centennial Olympic Park, the sounds of desperate cries for help caught his attention. James hesitated for a moment, his instinct for self-preservation warring with a part of himself he thought he'd buried long ago, the part that cared about others. "Fuck it," he growled, changing course and heading towards the source of the cries. The scene that greeted him at the park was one of pure chaos. A small group of survivors was cornered near the Fountain of Rings, surrounded by a growing horde of the undead. Without hesitation, James sprang into action. Drawing his pistol, he fired with deadly accuracy. Bang, 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 dropping the nearest zombies with headshots. The survivors looked up in shock as James carved a path through the undead, his movements fluid and precise. "Move!" he shouted, gesturing for the group to follow him. As they ran, James caught glimpses of the survivors he'd just rescued. A young woman with determination in her eyes, an older man with a military bearing, a teenage girl who looked shell-shocked, and a shifty-looking guy who seemed more interested in James's gun than in their escape. They made it to a nearby building, barricading themselves inside. As the adrenaline began to fade, James took stock of the group he'd just saved. The young woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'm Sarah." James nodded, his expression guarded. "James," he replied simply. The ex-military man introduced himself as Marcus, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The teenage girl, Lily, huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The last member of the group, Frank, hung back, his gaze darting between James and the others. As the group caught their breath, James's mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. He'd acted on instinct, saving these people without a second thought. But now, looking at their expectant faces, he realized he'd just taken on a responsibility he wasn't sure he wanted. Sarah broke the silence. "What's happening out there? Is it really zombies?" James ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. "Looks that way," he replied gruffly. "Whatever it is, it's turning people into monsters." Marcus stepped forward, his military training evident in his posture. "We need a plan. Supplies, weapons, a secure location." James nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. He knew the city better than most, including the dark corners and hidden places that might offer sanctuary. "I know a place," he said, his voice low, "but getting there won't be easy." As he spoke, James caught sight of his reflection in a broken window. The hardened ex-gangster stared back at him, but there was something different in his eyes now, a spark of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. Lily's quiet voice broke through his thoughts. "We're all going to die," she yelled, her eyes wide with fear. James felt something stir within him, a protective instinct he thought he'd lost long ago. He knelt down beside her, his voice softening. "Not if I can help it, kid." Standing up, James addressed the group. "Listen up. The world out there has gone to shit, and it's only going to get worse. If you want to survive, you'll need to trust me and do exactly as I say. Can you handle that?" The others exchanged glances before nodding their agreement. James took a deep breath, the weight of their lives now resting on his shoulders. "All right," he said, reloading his weapon. "Let's move out." As they prepared to venture back into the chaos outside, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The streets of Atlanta had become a war zone, and he was now responsible for more than just his own survival. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years looking out for only himself, and now, amid the apocalypse, he'd found himself leading a group of strangers. As they moved towards the door, James readied himself for what lay ahead. Chapter 2: Surviving the Streets. As they made their way down Edgewood Avenue, James's eyes darted from building to building, scanning for any signs of movement. The street was a far cry from its usual bustling self. Abandoned cars littered the road, their doors left open in haste. Shattered glass crunched beneath their feet, and the acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. "Stay close," James growled, his voice low and tense. "This ain't the Edgewood you knew." Sarah moved up beside him, her face etched with concern. "You seem to know these streets well," she observed, her tone a mix of curiosity and wariness. James's jaw tightened, memories of his past life flooding back. "Yeah, well, let's just say I've got history here," he muttered, pushing away the ghosts of his gangster days. As they approached the intersection of Edgewood and Boulevard, James held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. Ahead, a small gang of men had set up a makeshift barricade, their faces hard and their eyes hungry. "Well, well, well," a voice called out, dripping with malice. "Looks like we got ourselves some fresh meat." James's hand instinctively moved to his pistol, but he hesitated. He recognized the voice. It belonged to Razor, a low-level enforcer he'd run with back in the day. "Razor," James called back, his voice steady. "It's James. Remember me?" There was a moment of tense silence before Razor emerged from behind the barricade, his eyes widening in recognition. "Holy shit, it really is you. Thought you was dead, man. James stepped forward, keeping his group behind him. Not dead yet. We're just passing through. No trouble. Razor's eyes narrowed, flicking between James and the others. You know the rules, James. Ain't nothing free these days. You want passage, you gotta pay the toll. Behind him, James could feel the tension radiating from his group. Marcus's hand was already on his weapon, ready for a fight. But James knew better. They couldn't afford to make enemies this early in the game. Come on, Razor, James said, his voice taking on a hint of his old street swagger. For old time's sake, we got nothing worth taking, and you know I'm good for a favor down the line. Razor seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze lingering on Lily and Sarah. All right, Razor finally conceded. For old time's sake, but you owe me, James, and debts always get paid in this town. With a nod to his men, Razor stepped aside, allowing the group to pass. As they moved through the barricade, James could feel the hungry eyes of Razor's gang on them. He knew this wouldn't be the last time they'd face such encounters. Once they were clear of the gang's territory, Marcus rounded on James. You want to explain what that was all about? He demanded, his military training evident in his stance. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. Like I said, I've got history here. Used to run with some of these gangs back in the day, figured it might come in handy. Sarah's eyes widened in realization. You were a gangster? Was, James emphasized. That life's behind me now, but the connections, they might just keep us alive. Before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. In the distance, near the entrance to the Krog Street tunnel, a group of zombies had cornered a woman and her child. Without hesitation, James sprinted towards the scene, his group following close behind. Drawing his pistol, he took aim at the nearest zombie, its rotting face turning towards him with a snarl. The gunshot echoed through the street as James's bullet found its mark, dropping the zombie in its tracks. The others turned, their dead eyes fixing on the new threat. James moved with a fluid grace, years of street fighting coming back to him in an instant. He ducked under grasping hands, his knife flashing as he took down zombie after zombie. Marcus's precise shots dropped the ones James couldn't reach, the two men working in perfect sync. In the chaos, James caught sight of the woman and child, huddled against the wall of the tunnel. Run, he shouted at them, creating an opening in the zombie ranks. As the survivors fled, running away from the group and vanishing around a corner, James found himself surrounded by a group of zombies. A zombie lunged at him, its teeth snapping inches from his face. Without thinking, James drove his knife up through its jaw, black blood splattering his face and oozing all over his hand and down his arm. Breathing heavily, James stood, surveying the carnage around him. The others approached cautiously, their faces a mix of awe and fear at the violence they'd just witnessed. Everyone okay? James asked, wiping his blade clean on a zombie's tattered clothing. Sarah nodded, her face pale. That was intense. You really know how to handle yourself. As they prepared to enter the Krog Street tunnel, Lily's quiet voice broke the tension. How did you learn to fight like that? James paused, memories of street brawls and prison yard fights flashing through his mind. Life teaches you hard lessons, kid. I just learned to survive. The group moved into the tunnel, the echoes of their footsteps mixing with the distant groans of the undead. James took point, his senses on high alert. He knew that every step they took deeper into the city brought new dangers, both from the living and the dead. As they emerged on the other side of the tunnel, the Atlanta skyline loomed before them, a stark reminder of the civilization they'd lost. James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These people were looking to him for leadership, for protection. It was a role he'd never sought, but one he now found himself embracing. Where to now? Frank asked, his shifty eyes darting nervously around. James considered their options. They needed supplies, weapons, and a safe place to regroup. His mind raced through the possibilities, weighing the risks of each potential destination. We head for Little 5 Points, he decided. I know a place where we might be able to hole up for a bit, maybe find some supplies. Chapter 3. Blood on the Beltline. The Beltline might be our best shot at getting across town without running into too many of those things, James explained, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Sarah nodded in agreement. It's more open, too. We should be able to see danger coming. As they approached the entrance to the East Side Trail, the stark contrast between the Beltline's intended purpose and its current state was jarring. The colorful murals that once adorned the walls were now splattered with blood, and the carefully maintained greenery had begun to wilt and overgrow in the absence of human care. James held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. "Hold up," he whispered, crouching down to examine something on the ground. "Fresh tracks. We're not alone out here." Marcus moved up beside him, his military training evident in his posture. "Zombies?" James shook his head. "No, these are two organized, probably survivors." The group exchanged uneasy glances. They'd already learned that the living could be just as dangerous as the undead. James considered their options. "We keep moving, but stay alert. Marcus, you take rear guard. I'll lead. Sarah, Frank, keep Lily close." As they made their way along the Beltline, the scenic views that had once drawn tourists and locals alike were now a grim reminder of the world they'd lost. James was checking all the bodies for guns and ammo. James said, "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus replied, "Do you think that gun ammo gonna last forever? This ain't the Dawn of the Dead movie. Sooner or later your gun's gonna be worthless, with no ammo." The Atlanta skyline loomed in the distance, smoke still rising from several buildings. Lily's voice broke the tense silence. "I used to come here with my parents," she said softly, her eyes distant with memory. "We'd ride bikes and get ice cream." James felt a pain in his chest, memories of his own estranged daughter flooding back. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the path ahead. James raised his hand, signaling the group to stop and take cover. "James," Sarah whispered urgently, pointing towards a nearby bridge. Following her gaze, James saw movement on the bridge ahead. A group of survivors, heavily armed and looking desperate, had set up a makeshift barricade. "Shit," James muttered. "Ambush." Before they could retreat, a voice called out from the bridge. "That's far enough. This is our territory now. You want to pass, you pay the toll." James's mind raced, weighing their options. They couldn't afford a confrontation, but they also couldn't turn back. "We don't want any trouble," James called back, his voice steady. "We're just passing through." The leader of the group on the bridge, a burly man with a scarred face, laughed. "Ain't no such thing as just passing through anymore, friend. You pay or you turn back." James could feel the tension radiating from his group. Marcus's hand was already on his weapon, ready for a fight. "What's the toll?" James asked, buying time as he formulated a plan. The scarred man grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "Everything you got, weapons, food, supplies, and those women." James felt a surge of anger at the man's words. He glanced at Sarah and Lily, seeing the fear in their eyes. "That's not going to happen," James growled, his hand moving to his pistol. The tension in the air was thick as both groups faced off. James knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but he'd be damned if he was going to let these thugs take advantage of them. At that moment, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. From behind the ambushers' barricade, a horde of zombies emerged, drawn by the commotion. "Shit! Open fire!" the scarred man yelled, his group turning their attention to the undead threat. James saw their opportunity. "Move!" he shouted to his group, leading them towards a nearby maintenance tunnel. As they ran, the sound of gunfire and screams filled the air. The zombies had broken through the barricade, overwhelming the ambushers. "In here!" James called, ushering his group into the tunnel. The narrow passageway was dark and damp, but it offered a temporary refuge from the chaos outside. As they caught their breath, Marcus spoke up. "We need those weapons and ammo, or what's left of it." James nodded, his mind already working on their next move. James told Sarah, Lily, and Frank to stay put, while he and Marcus get whatever guns and ammo they can find. James exited their hiding spot, and with precision shots, killed off what remaining people were left alive on the bridge. But now the zombies focused their attention on James and Marcus. They both ran toward the bridge, then away from it. The zombies followed, and James and Marcus ran a couple blocks and looped back to the bridge. As they were checking the dead bodies for guns and ammo, the leader was still alive, but bleeding from the chunks of meat that were bitten from his body by the zombies, asked for help. James looked down, pulled out his gun, and said, "Sorry, pal, your days are up." Bang! A bullet through the head, brains splattered the pavement. James and Marcus returned to the group. James said, "All good here. Let's go." As they moved through the tunnel, the sounds of the zombie horde grew fainter. James led the way, his senses on high alert for any sign of danger. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the tunnel. James held up his hand, signaling the group to stop. "We've got company," he whispered, drawing his knife. From the darkness ahead, a lone zombie stumbled towards them, its movements uncoordinated. James moved forward, ready to take it down quietly. But as he approached, the zombie lunged with unexpected speed. James barely had time to react as its rotting hands grasped at him. In the confined space of the tunnel, James struggled to maneuver. The zombie's teeth snapped inches from his face as he fought to keep it at bay. "James!" Sarah cried out, her voice filled with panic. Just as the zombie seemed about to overpower him, James found his opening. With a swift movement, he drove his knife up through the zombie's jaw, black blood splatting on his face and oozing from the skull. The zombie went limp, and James shoved it away, breathing heavily. "You okay?" Marcus asked, moving up beside him. James nodded, wiping the blood from his face. "Yeah, just a little too close for comfort." As they continued through the tunnel, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. Finally, they reached the exit. James pushed open the heavy metal door, revealing the sprawling little 5-point store before them. "All right, we need to move fast," James instructed. "We'll do a quick sweep for supplies, then find a secure spot to rest." As they made their way through the abandoned market, the group scavenged what they could from the various shops and stalls. Canned food, water bottles, and a few useful tools were quickly added to their packs. But their luck couldn't last forever. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with another group of survivors, equally surprised by the encounter. For a tense moment, both groups stood frozen, weapons half raised. James's mind raced, trying to gauge whether these people were a threat or potential allies. The leader of the other group, a woman with fierce eyes and a shotgun, broke the silence. "What are your names?" James stepped forward, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "We're just passing through, looking for supplies. We don't want any trouble." The woman's eyes narrowed, assessing James and his group. "This is our territory. We've fought hard to keep it safe." James nodded, understanding their position. "We respect that. We'll take what we've found and be on our way." The woman seemed to consider this for a moment before lowering her weapon slightly. "You look like you've seen some shit. Where are you headed?" "Trying to find a safe place," James replied honestly. "Somewhere we can hole up and figure out our next move." The woman exchanged glances with her group before turning back to James. "We might be able to help each other out. We've got a secure location, but we could use some extra hands to defend it." James felt a glimmer of hope, but caution kept him wary. "And what's the catch?" The woman smiled grimly. "No catch. Just survival. In this world, strength in numbers might be the only thing that keeps us alive." As James considered the offer, he felt the weight of his group's eyes on him. They were looking to him for guidance, for protection. The decision he made now could mean the difference between life and death. James said, "Thanks for the offer, but we're better on our own. We're headed to the underground." Marcus and James kept an eye on the group until they disappeared in the distance. Chapter 4. Underground Nightmare. The flickering emergency lights cast an eerie glow through the cavernous halls of underground Atlanta. James led his group cautiously down the escalators, their footsteps echoing in the unsettling quiet. The once bustling shopping district now stood as a silent testament to the world they'd lost. "Stay close," James whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. "This place is a maze, easy to get lost or cornered." Sarah moved up beside him, her voice low. "You've been here before?" James nodded, memories of less savory dealings flashing through his mind. "Yeah, back when it was still open. Used to be a good place to conduct business." As they moved deeper into the complex, the stale air grew heavy with the scent of decay. Overturned kiosks and abandoned storefronts told the story of panic and looters after the hasty evacuation. Lily clung close to Sarah, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't like it down here." Lily whispered, "It feels like a tomb." James felt a bit of protectiveness. "We won't stay long, kid. Just need to find some ammo and maybe a safe place to rest." As they rounded a corner, a flicker of movement caught James's eye. He held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. In the dim light, he could make out figures moving in the distance, too coordinated to be zombies. "We've got company," James muttered, drawing his pistol. "And they ain't friendly." Before they could retreat, a spotlight suddenly illuminated them, momentarily blinding the group. Harsh voices rang out from the darkness. "Don't move, hands where we can see them." James squinted against the light, making out the silhouettes of armed men. His mind raced, assessing their options. A man stepped forward, his face obscured by the harsh backlight. Well, what do we have here? Looks like we caught ourselves some trespassers." James kept his voice steady, his hand still on his weapon. "We're just passing through, looking for ammo and supplies. We don't want any trouble." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Trouble? Oh, you've already found that, my friend. This here's our territory." Marcus tensed beside James, his military training evident in his posture. "We've got nothing worth taking," he growled. "Oh, I wouldn't say that," the man replied, his gaze lingering on Sarah and Lily. "Pretty girls like that, they're worth quite a bit these days." The man's demeanor shifted, his hand moving to his own weapon. "I don't think you understand the situation here. This world is not the world it was yesterday. The only laws are the laws we make. The police and the government have all abandoned us, leaving us to survive. Money is useless in this new world. Food, we can find that anywhere. But a fresh piece of ass that is not a zombie is hard to come by. So when I tell you, those women are now mine, I'm not joking, sir. But don't you worry, I'll take really good care of them." James's mind raced, weighing their options. They couldn't afford a firefight in these close quarters, but he'd be damned if he was going to let these thugs take Sarah and Lily. "All right," James said, his voice carefully controlled. "You can have anything and everything we have, except the women." The man grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Everything you got, we're taking the weapons, food, supplies, and the girls for hospitality." James felt the tension radiating from his group. He knew they were looking to him for leadership, for protection. At that moment, he made his decision. "How about this instead?" James said, his voice taking on the hard edge of his gangster past. "You let us pass, and I don't paint these walls with your brains." The man's eyes narrowed, recognizing the threat in James's tone. "You've got some big balls of steel, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered, son, and outgunned. What makes you think you can take us?" James stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "Because I've been to hell and back, and I've got nothing left to lose. You really want to test me?" For a tense moment, the two men stared each other down. James could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, the violence, the ruthlessness he'd tried to leave behind. But in this new world, those old skills might be the only thing keeping them alive. "Zombies!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted as both groups scrambled to defend their territory. James saw their opportunity. "Move!" he shouted to his group, leading them away from the chaos. As they ran, the sounds of gunfire and screams filled the air. James's mind raced, trying to remember the layout of the underground complex. They needed to find an exit before they were trapped between the militia and the zombies. "This way," he called, guiding them through a maze of abandoned shops and corridors. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a group of zombies, their rotting faces contorted in hunger. Without hesitation, James opened fire, dropping the nearest ones with precise headshots. "Marcus, cover our six!" James shouted as he led the group forward. The narrow passageways echoed with the sound of gunfire and the snarls of the undead. James moved with fluid precision, years of street fighting coming back to him in an instant. He ducked under grasping hands, his knife cutting and stabbing as he took down zombie after zombie. As they fought their way through the horde, James caught sight of a service exit. "There!" he shouted, pointing towards the door. "That's our way out." But as they approached the exit, James realized with growing dread that it was chained shut. He threw his weight against it, but the chains held firm. "Shit!" he cursed, turning back to face the oncoming zombies. "We need to find another way." Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "James, over here!" She was pointing to a narrow maintenance shaft, barely visible in the dim light. Without hesitation, James ushered the group towards the shaft. "Go! I'll hold them off!" Sarah and Lily scrambled into the shaft, followed by Frank. James and Marcus stood their ground against the approaching horde. The two men worked in perfect sync, their weapons blazing as they bought time for the others to escape. "Marcus, go!" James shouted as the last of their group disappeared into the shaft. "I'm right behind you!" As Marcus retreated, James felt a hand grasp his ankle. He looked down to see a zombie crawling towards him. The zombie's legs were missing, intestines dragging behind as the zombie slid along the floor, leaving a trail of blood, its jaw snapping hungrily. With a swift movement, James brought his boot down on its skull, repeatedly smashing the zombie's skull. James thought to himself, this isn't as easy as the movies and audiobooks made it out to be. Feeling the sickening crunch of bone, the zombie went limp. But the moment's distraction cost him. Another zombie lunged forward, its teeth sinking into James's forearm. He cried out in pain, stumbling backward towards the shaft. "James!" Sarah's voice echoed from inside the shaft. "Hurry!" With a surge of adrenaline, James tore himself free from the zombie's grasp and dove into the shaft. The others pulled him through as the sounds of the undead grew closer. As they emerged on the other side, gasping for breath, James leaned against the wall, clutching his injured arm. The bite marks stood out starkly against his skin, a grim reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw the wound. "James, you're bit." The group fell silent, the implications of those words hanging heavy in the air. James looked at each of their faces, the fear, the concern, the dawning realization of what this meant. "We don't know if," Sarah began, her voice trailing off. James shook his head, his jaw set. "We can't take that chance. You know what has to happen." Marcus stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. "I'll do it," he said grimly. "You've saved our lives. It's the least I can do." James held up his hand, stopping Marcus. "Not yet. We need to find a safe place first. I'll let you know when it's time." As they made their way out of the underground complex and into the streets above, James could feel the weight of his mortality pressing down on him. The bite on his arm throbbed, a constant reminder of the ticking clock. But as he looked at the faces of his group, Sarah's determination, Lily's innocence, Marcus's strength, and Frank looking like a dumb ass, James knew he couldn't give up yet. He'd led them this far, and he'd be damned if he was going to leave them now. The Atlanta skyline loomed before them, a stark reminder of the civilization they'd lost. James squared his shoulders, pushing aside the pain and fear. They had survived the underground nightmare, but he knew that greater challenges lay ahead. Chapter 5. The Fall of Midtown. The Atlanta skyline loomed before them, a jagged silhouette against the blood-red sky of dusk. James led his battered group through the eerily quiet streets of Midtown, his injured arm throbbing with each step. The bite mark on his forearm was a constant reminder of their narrow escape from underground Atlanta and the ticking clock of his own mortality. As they approached Piedmont Park, the distant sound of gunfire shattered the uneasy silence. James held up his hand, signaling the group to take cover behind an overturned city bus. "What's going on?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with concern. James peered around the edge of the bus, his experienced gaze taking in the scene before them. In the expansive green space of Piedmont Park, a military operation was unfolding. Soldiers in full combat gear were moving in formation, their M4 carbines trained on anything that moved. "Looks like the cavalry's arrived," James muttered, his voice tinged with skepticism. "But I'm not sure if that's good news for us." Marcus crawled up beside him, his military training evident in his cautious movements. "Those aren't regular army," he observed, his brow furrowed. "Their gear is mismatched and their formation is sloppy. I'd bet my last bullet they're a rogue unit." As if to confirm Marcus's assessment, a burst of gunfire erupted from the soldiers' position. James watched in horror as they opened fire on a group of civilians desperately trying to reach what they thought was safety. "Jesus Christ!" Frank hissed. "They're shooting everyone." James felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. He'd seen this kind of indiscriminate violence before, back in his gang days. The strong preying on the weak, using chaos as an excuse for cruelty. "We need to move," James said, his voice low and urgent. "If those trigger-happy bastards spot us, we're dead." As they prepared to retreat, a high-pitched scream cut through the air. James's head snapped around, his eyes scanning the park. There, trapped between an advancing group of zombies and the military's line of fire, was a young girl. James felt his heart skip a beat. The girl couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, her blonde hair matted with blood and dirt. At that moment, all he could see was his own daughter's face. Without thinking, James bolted from their cover, ignoring the protests of his group. "James, wait!" Sarah called after him, but he was already halfway across the street. James moved with a fluid grace, years of street fights and narrow escapes guiding his every step. He ducked under grasping zombie hands, his knife moving at lightning-like speeds as he carved a path towards the girl. The soldiers, noticing the commotion, turned their weapons towards James. Bullets whizzed past his head, kicking up dirt at his feet. But James didn't slow down. He reached the girl just as a zombie lunged for her, its rotting teeth bared, hands and face blackened with dry blood. With a swift motion, James drove his knife into the zombie's skull, black blood splattering his face. He scooped up the terrified girl in his arms and turned to run, only to find their escape route cut off by more of the undead. "Shit!" James muttered, his eyes darting around for an escape route. "Hold on tight, kid," he said to the girl, who clung to him like a lifeline. James sprinted towards the opening, zigzagging to avoid the hail of bullets from the increasingly frantic soldiers. He could hear the snarls of the zombies close behind, spurring him on despite the burning pain in his bitten arm. Just as they reached the tunnel entrance, James felt a sharp pain in his leg. A stray bullet had grazed his thigh, sending him stumbling. But he gritted his teeth and pushed on, practically diving behind a car to take cover. The sounds of gunfire and zombie snarls faded as the rogue military guys killed most of the horde. James set the girl down gently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You okay, kid?" he asked, checking her for injuries. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear and awe. You saved me," she whispered. James felt a lump form in his throat. The girl's blue eyes reminded him so much of his own daughter. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lila," she replied, her voice barely audible. James nodded, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "Nice to meet you, Lila. I'm James. We're going to get you out of here, okay?" As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed through the streets. James tensed, reaching for his weapon, but relaxed when he saw Sarah and the others approaching. "Jesus, James," Marcus growled, though there was a hint of admiration in his voice. "You trying to get yourself killed?" James shrugged, wincing as the movement aggravated his injured arm. "Couldn't leave her behind," he said simply, nodding towards Lila. Sarah knelt down beside the girl, her face softening. "Hi there," she said gently. "Are you hurt?" As Sarah tended to Lila, Frank paced nervously, watching for the rogue soldiers. "We can't stay here," he said, his eyes darting back and forth. "Those soldiers or the zombies could find us any minute." James nodded, pushing himself to his feet despite the pain. "Frank's right. We need to keep moving." As they made their way through the side streets, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. After walking for what seemed like miles, they came across the High Museum of Art. "We'll rest here for a bit," James decided, his body screaming for a moment's respite. "Marcus, Frank, see if you can find anything useful. Sarah, Lily, keep an eye on Lila." As the others dispersed, James slumped against a wall, finally allowing himself to feel the full extent of his injuries. The bite on his arm throbbed, and he could feel the heat of infection setting in. He knew he was running out of time. Sarah approached him, her face showing concern. "Let me take a look at that," she said, gesturing to his arm. James shook his head. "It's fine. Save the medical supplies for the others." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "James, don't be stupid. We need you at full strength." Before James could protest further, a crash echoed from somewhere above them. Everyone froze, eyes darting to the ceiling. "What was that?" Lily whispered, clinging to Sarah's side. James pushed himself off the wall, ignoring the pain. "Trouble," he growled. "Everyone, grab what you can. We're moving out." As they gathered their meager supplies, the sound of heavy footsteps grew closer. James positioned himself at the front of the group, his weapon at the ready. The door to the storage area burst open, revealing a group of soldiers, the same ones from the park. Their leader, a grizzled man with cold eyes, stepped forward. "Well, well," he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Looks like we found ourselves some rats. James felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, his mind already calculating their odds. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but he'd be damned if he was going to let these bastards hurt his group. "We don't want any trouble," James said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Just let us be, and we'll cause no trouble for you." The soldiers' leader laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Oh, I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, we can't have civilians running around spreading the infection. It's nothing personal, just following orders." As the soldiers raised their weapons, James felt a surge of protective rage. He thought of Lily, Lila, and Sarah, the group he'd sworn to protect. At that moment, he made a decision. "Marcus," James said, his voice low and dangerous, "remember that move we pulled in the underground?" Marcus nodded, a grim smile on his face. "On your mark, boss." What happened next was a blur of violence and chaos. James and Marcus moved in perfect sync, years of combat experience guiding their actions. They used the narrow confines of the storage area to their advantage, turning the soldiers' superior numbers against them. James fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. Every punch, every knife thrust, every shot fired was fueled by a desperate need to protect his makeshift family. He took hits and felt bullets graze his skin, but he didn't slow down. In the midst of the melee, James caught sight of Lila, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the violence unfold. For a moment, he saw his own daughter's face superimposed over hers, and it nearly broke him. But then Sarah was there, shielding Lily from the worst of the carnage, her own face set in grim determination. And James knew he couldn't give up, not when they were counting on him. The fight seemed to last an eternity, but in reality, it was over in minutes. The soldiers lay scattered on the ground, some groaning in pain, others ominously still. James stood there, looking at the carnage, his chest heaving, blood, both his and others, staining his clothes. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The group nodded, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Lily and Lila clung to Sarah, their small frames shaking with silent sobs. James searched the bodies and took what ammo and guns were usable. James knelt down in front of Lila, ignoring the protest of his battered body. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "I know that was scary, but you're safe now. We're not going to let anything happen to you." Lila looked up at him, her blue eyes shimmering with tears. "Promise?" she whispered. James felt something shift inside him, a resolve solidifying in his chest. "I promise," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. As they made their way out of the High Museum and back onto the streets of Midtown, James couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The fall of Midtown had shown them the true face of this new world, a place where even those sworn to protect could become the greatest threat. But as he looked at the faces of his group, Sarah's determination, Marcus's strength, Frank's cunning, and Lily's fragile hope, James knew that they had found something worth fighting for. In this broken world, they had become a family. The Atlanta skyline loomed before them, a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. But for the first time since the outbreak began, James felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived the fall of Midtown, and whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 6: Fortress of the Fallen. The Hyatt Regency Atlanta loomed before them, its glass facade reflecting the chaos that had engulfed the city. James led the group towards the hotel's entrance, his injured arm throbbing with each step. The bite mark on his forearm seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a constant reminder of the ticking clock that was his mortality. "This place looks promising," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the building's imposing structure. "If we can clear it out, it could be a good base for a while." James nodded, his jaw set with determination. "It's defensible, has plenty of rooms, and might still have some supplies. But first, we need to make sure it's clear." As they approached the main entrance, the sound of shuffling feet and low groans echoed from within. James held up his hand, signaling the group to stop. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice low and authoritative. "We do this room by room, floor by floor. Marcus, you're with me. Sarah, Frank, you watch our six. Lily, Lila, you two stay close to Sarah, okay?" The group nodded, falling into formation as they had done so many times before. James couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at how far they'd come, how well they worked together now. With practiced efficiency, they entered the hotel lobby. The once grand space was now a shadow of its former self, littered with overturned furniture and smeared with dark stains James didn't want to think too hard about. The first zombie appeared from behind the reception desk, its decaying face twisted in a perpetual snarl. James moved forward, his knife flashing in the dim light as he took it down with a swift, brutal efficiency. More of the undead emerged from the shadows, drawn by the commotion. Marcus opened fire, his shots echoing through the cavernous lobby. Sarah and Frank covered their flanks, working in tandem to keep the zombies at bay. As they fought their way through the lobby, James felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He stumbled, nearly falling as he dispatched another zombie. "James!" Sarah called out, concern evident in her voice. "Are you okay?" James shook his head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to be settling over his mind. "I'm fine," he growled, pushing through the pain and fatigue. "Keep moving." They made their way up the stairs, clearing each floor methodically. The hotel seemed to be an endless maze of corridors and rooms, each one potentially hiding danger. As they reached the 10th floor, James felt his strength beginning to wane. The infection from the bite was spreading, he could feel it in his bones, but he pushed on, determined to see this through. "This floor looks good," Marcus said, his military training evident in his assessment. "Plenty of rooms, good vantage points, and only one way up or down." James nodded, leaning against the wall for support. "All right, let's secure it. Frank and Sarah, start checking the rooms. Marcus, help me barricade the stairwell." As they worked to fortify their new base, James could feel the concerned glances of his group. He knew they could see the toll the infection was taking on him, but he refused to acknowledge it. There was still work to be done. Hours passed as they cleared out the remaining zombies and set up their defenses. By the time they were finished, night had fallen, casting the city in an eerie darkness broken only by the occasional fire burning in the distance. James stood by the window, looking out over the ruined cityscape. He could feel the fever burning through him now, his vision blurring at the edges. "James," Sarah's soft voice came from behind him. "We need to talk about what's happening to you." He turned to face the group, seeing the mix of concern and fear in their eyes. Lily and Lila stood close to Sarah, their young faces covered with tears. "I know," James said, his voice rough. "I don't have much time left." Marcus stepped forward, his face grim. "We've seen how this goes," James replied. "You know what needs to happen." James nodded, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I know, but not yet. I need to make sure you're all safe first." The next couple of days passed in a blur for James. He pushed himself to the limit, helping to reinforce their defenses and scavenge for supplies. But with each passing hour, he could feel himself slipping away. On the third night, James knew it was time. He gathered the group in one of the hotel rooms, his body racked with fever and pain. "Listen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've done a lot of bad things in my life, but being with you all, protecting you, it's given me a chance at redemption. I need you to promise me something." Sarah took his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Anything, James." "Take care of each other," he said, his eyes moving from face to face. "You're a family now, and Lila—" He turned to the young girl, seeing in her the daughter he'd lost so long ago. "Stay strong, kid. You've got a lot of fight in you." Lila nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I will, James, I promise." James took a shuddering breath, feeling the last of his strength ebbing away. "Marcus," he said, turning to the ex-soldier, "you know what to do." Marcus nodded solemnly, drawing his pistol. "It's been an honor, James." As James felt the darkness closing in, he looked at the faces of the people who had become his family. In their eyes he saw not the hardened criminal he had once been, but the protector, the leader, the friend he had become. With his last breath, James whispered, "Thank you, brother." The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the hotel room. In the days that followed, the group mourned the loss of their leader and friend, but they also found strength in each other, in the family that James had brought together. They stayed in the Hyatt Regency, turning it into a fortress against the horrors of the outside world. Sarah took on the role of leader, her compassion tempered by the hard lessons James had taught them. Marcus became their head of security, his military experience proving invaluable. Frank, despite his shifty nature, found a place as their scrounger and scout. And Lily, the young girl who had lost so much, began to flourish under the protective care of her new family. And Lila, the youngest, looked up to her new sister Lily. As the weeks turned into months, they encountered other survivors. Some they welcomed into their sanctuary, others they had to defend against. But through it all, they remembered James's final words, taking care of each other and staying strong in the face of adversity. One evening, as the sun set over the ruined Atlanta skyline, Sarah stood at the same window where James had stood on that first night. She looked out at the city, forever changed by the apocalypse, and felt a mix of sorrow and hope. "We're still here, James," she whispered to the fading light. "We're still fighting, and we won't forget what you did for us." As darkness fell, the lights of the Hyatt Regency flickered to life, a beacon of hope in a world of shadows. Inside, a family forged in the fires of the apocalypse continued to survive, to live, and to honor the memory of the man who had brought them together. The city of the dead stretched out before them, full of dangers and challenges yet to come. But within the walls of their fortress, the legacy of James lived on, a testament to the power of redemption and the unbreakable bonds of family found in the darkest of times.